Everyone on some level in some way is affected by all of the eclipses, but it's only some people in some ways that are more intensely affected by eclipses. So in other words, you have to have in astrology a planet near the eclipse degree, and most astrologers kind of take an orb of 5 degrees, within 5 degrees. But if you have a planet anywhere near the eclipse degree or opposite, and also you're in a cycle of one of the nodes, for example, and let's face it, usually, someone is on some level, even if you want to break it down to like 6 levels, right? We can break the dashas or cycles down to 6 levels. So it showed that most likely, if you have a planet anywhere near the eclipse degree and you're in a cycle of one of the eclipses itself, Rahu or Ketu, the north or south node, you're going to experience the effects of the eclipse in a stronger way. And especially, and more specifically, let's be more specific about this now, in relation to what that planet in your chart rules, the house it rules in your chart, in other words, and where it's happening in your chart by house position. So these are all the things you have to take into account. Otherwise, you're just talking about eclipses as generally affecting people. And let me just say, first of all, eclipses affect everyone generally because it's the extreme ends of the lunar phases, but they're more extreme with the eclipses. So you have the new moon and the full moon, which are already extreme. Then you put a new moon, which is a solar eclipse, and a full moon, which is a lunar eclipse, into the mix, and it just further exaggerates the split in a way. However, it also almost like splits it apart so much that it kind of brings it back together again and sort of lines everything up, as it were. So what you end up seeing happening for eclipses is, and you'll notice this as well over the coming weeks now, we're heading into eclipses, right? You'll notice how everything gets ramped up, everything gets exaggerated and possibly also distorted, but also things are highlighted and revealed. And so eclipses are all about revelations, all about revealing things. Ketu is more so about revealing things from the past, uncovering things. Rahu can block things more than anything, but it can also reveal things or bring different insights or perspectives into things, but it's more likely to block things. So Ketu is the unblocker, if you will, for Rahu's blocking tendency. So that's a general thing to look at in the chart. Now, both eclipses and any eclipse, a new moon or a full moon, are going to create this kind of extreme weather, astrological weather. And so that leads to kind of extremes in terms of how people are feeling as well. Generally, the new moon is a more kind of downtime of the month anyway, but a new moon solar eclipse is like a hyped up sort of at the same time tired period. So it's like that phrase when we're feeling wired and tired. That's like a solar eclipse. So obviously it's important just to slow down and pay attention and to reset everything for the solar eclipse. So that happens on the 4th of December. The lunar eclipse before then, on the 19th of November, so this coming weekend, is more like a ramped up experience. And this lunar eclipse is particularly ramped up, I should say, because it's not only a full moon, which is itself ramped up and the energy is full on, it's exalted in Taurus and conjunct Rahu, which further exaggerates and distorts it. So there can be a lot of extremes here in terms of the Taurus themes. And so whatever Taurus is for you, wherever that is positioned by house position in your chart, and whatever the moon rules in your chart, as well as Rahu, all of those things will have a say in how you experience it more specifically. But generally, again, it's a ramped up, emotionally charged period where there can be a lot of excess indulgence and leading to a sense of lack, because that's always the thing with Rahu. It increases and blocks things. Like Kishori always says about Rahu, it's never in between. It's never, it's always either impossible or easy. It's never anything but impossible or easy. There's just no in between with Rahu. So it really ramps things up or it completely denies the very thing you want. So anyway, let's use these two example charts to highlight some themes, because unless we're actually looking at an individual, then it's all kind of general. And everybody, of course, I can't read for everybody, so we just have to take examples, and it's not really going to cut it to actually look at general world events and things like that. It will show you some themes, but it's not going to really show you the more specifics. Now, before I look at these, one of the general themes, the most obvious general themes, though, of Taurus, Scorpio, and we've seen it now with the agreement at COP26, is very much about resources. And this now agreement that they've come to seemingly to reduce coal production, which is very much a Scorpio theme. And you see, Ketu is in Scorpio right now. So it's about removing our reliance on fossil fuels, which is what Scorpio rules. Ketu removes things, at least reduces things in this case. And then Rahu in Taurus is exaggerating things. So we've seen an all-time high in the crypto market, like Bitcoin has reached an all-time high with Rahu in Taurus. But that's kind of also this kind of unreal situation. It is real in one way, but Rahu is always this all or nothing, impossible or easy. It's always an extreme. And that's what creates the issues, because when you have any kind of extremes, it's going to swing from one to the other. So that's a general theme of Taurus, Scorpio right now. We can quite clearly see happening around the world. This is Joe Biden's chart, a reminder of his birth details. He was born on the 20th of November, 1942 at 8:30 a.m. in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So his time of birth is not an AA rated, it's A rated. So it's not as exact as we would like, but it's A rated. So it's around this time, and so we can place him around the middle of Scorpio, and of course that's significant, and I'll show you why now in a minute. He has the Sun and Venus quite closely conjunct in Scorpio. That's also relevant. He has Saturn opposite at 16 degrees here of Taurus. That's also relevant because the eclipses are happening in this axis, so it's obviously going to affect him very personally. And in the weeks and months to follow, this will have an impact. Now, I've said in the past that Joe Biden will not finish out his presidency. I'm sticking with that. And when I was at the conference a couple of weeks ago, actually, I heard this from a speaker that they did a survey of astrologers. And they asked them, I don't know how many astrologers were there, but they did a survey on how many astrologers think that Joe Biden will finish out his term. And I think 2/3 of astrologers said that he wouldn't. So that's the great thing when you get connected with these kind of networks and astrologers, because I wasn't aware that actually most astrologers are actually saying this anyway. So it's not just me, obviously. So that's one thing. I'm obviously not the only one saying this. And you know, Western astrologers will have their own calculations and reasonings behind that. And if they're saying that with their calculations, and I'm showing this in my calculations, you know, it's likely that he will not finish out the presidency. But I actually didn't think about doing one on Joe Biden, and certainly not on Donald Trump, because I thought, well, you know, I've done so many already. But now we're actually at the eclipses. We're starting into this period of the eclipses. We have the Taurus eclipse coming up at 3 degrees of Taurus on the 19th, and that's almost exactly opposite his Sun and Venus. So we can see things beginning here. But what's really more impactful for Joe Biden is the fact that his rising sign is here and his Venus and Sun are here, where Ketu are subsequently, or where Ketu will subsequently transit into the end of this year and the beginning of next year. And also that Mars will transit the eclipse degree in his rising sign. And of course, why this? Why is the prediction? Well, first of all, it's because Ketu is in Scorpio and transiting his Sun more than anything. And because the Sun rules his 10th house. That's the key thing. The Sun rules his 10th house of career. Ketu, Sun combinations, and an eclipse that's coming up now on the 4th of December, with Mars subsequently transiting over on the 31st of December, will likely show the beginning of the end, in my opinion, for Joe Biden's presidency. I don't know what that would look like. You know, I don't know the exact details about that, but there could be something that's revealed and then shows it's kind of like downward spiral in terms of his presidency. Now, if it were that alone, I wouldn't necessarily say that he would be, because generally that's another thing to think, that Ketu eclipses show losses, and especially when you're talking about it affecting the person's sun, and then especially when it's the 10th lord, this kind of shows high position kind of being, lost. But generally, like traditionally, astrologers would have looked at eclipses as the fall of the king or the leader, the head of government in modern day, right? So that's obvious, you know. But when we see the fact that the cycles he's in, that's another indication here, because as I mentioned previously and many times now at this stage, he's in a Jupiter Rahu cycle until he reaches September next year, when it begins a Saturn cycle here in the 7th house. And this Saturn is blocking his 10th house. Without going too much into the complex calculations, but this is Argala. This is a concept of certain houses helping, certain houses hindering a certain area. And for the 10th house of career, the 7th house will hinder. So even though he has more planets in the first, which actually help, Saturn being in the 7th hindering, and the Saturn cycle coming up shows more potential here. So now when you add that, and the fact that he's in a Jupiter Rahu right now, and Rahu being triggered in the 7th house, when you add that to the mix of this particular eclipse in December and how that's going to transpire next year, you can basically see more of the potential. Now, when you add further the fact that the next eclipses are going to occur in his 12th and 6th house, and then his Lord is involved, as well as Mercury, with Ketu transiting here, then you can really see even higher potential. So if it doesn't happen, next year earlier, like I said, I think it's going to be by the end of next year anyway, that big changes occur. Now, I don't know enough about American politics, to be quite honest, and I don't really understand the whole system. Maybe somebody can enlighten me about that. But these midterm elections in November next year, if I'll do another video on the midterm election chart, because it's interesting. Let me put it that way. But I don't understand actually how things could change midterm, for anyone. If he's been elected for 4 years. I don't see how anything could change. But having said that, there's so many changes at the end of next year for him that something has to give, basically. So you can see that Joe Biden is really being impacted strongly by this eclipse. In other words, his Rahu in the 10th house as well. He's in this Rahu Dasha, this cycle of Rahu. Rahu's transiting his 7th house, where his Saturn is, opposite, obviously, in Ketu, all of this. So you can see that's high potential for losses. So here's Trump's chart. I didn't think we'd still be talking about Trump at this stage, but, we have to talk about him. And we can just use him as an example chart as well, because he is kind of there always in the background. There's this, even just this morning before I started recording this, I saw an article on the Guardian website about Donald Trump being almost, I don't know, how do they put it? The title of the article is "Terrifying for American Democracy. Is Trump planning for a 2024 coup?" I know that's kind of what sells newspapers and what, it's like clickbait, isn't it? But at the same time, we can see that he is hanging around still. He is still there, almost like a menacing force in the background. His role is in politics to challenge, to show the hidden elements. Whatever you think about Trump, he is born on a total lunar eclipse, right? The total lunar eclipse that's occurring on Friday is in his 10th house, whereas the solar eclipse is in his 4th house. So it has a big impact on him too. But he is Mr. Eclipse. This is the thing. He has this kind of challenging nature. And that's what eclipses are. They challenge the status quo. They reveal things that you weren't maybe aware of. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, he does have his finger on the pulse in many ways. He has great insights into things. And people mock him and all of this, but that's just a kind of way of shooing someone away who's maybe challenging you in some way. So I'm not pro or anti any of these politicians. I'm just looking at the charts. So here we see Sun and Rahu Uranus. He's got a Rahu Uranus conjunction, by the way, which is coming up next year. He's got Uranus Rahu, Sun, all at late degrees of Taurus. So this lunar eclipse isn't like hitting off anything. Likewise, his Ketu and Moon are at late degrees of Scorpio. So the solar eclipse isn't hitting off anything. So there's such a wide orb for these. So you can see here that it's not really impacting as strongly as Biden. And yet still, you're going to say that, okay, he's basically feeling this and this extreme, as we're all feeling this extreme. But for any Leo rising, and certainly Leo rising moon in Scorpio, there's an extreme going on right now for them, because Ketu has transited their moon, or is transiting, or will transit their moon. It's showing losses on some level, and it's bringing things up from the past. It's revealing things. It's bringing up a lot of fears. And Rahu in the 10th now, which in his chart is in the 10th, so it's obviously a notable return he's experienced recently, is showing this need for power, this power grabber who just wants to get power and resources to feel satiated, but there's never any satiating Rahu. This is all of the point of Rahu. Rahu in the 10th, although very powerful, it's this person who will just strive and strive and strive to become someone in the world because of a sense of lack in their private life, with Ketu in the 4th. So this is quite an extreme imbalance for Trump at the moment, because it's his 4th and 10th house, the kind of the highest and lowest parts of his being, his most public and most private. And so it really kind of shows this split that he's experiencing during this particular period now with these eclipses. But at the same time, it's maybe more personal for him. And even though it's also professional, I do think that it's a lot more personal for him. There's a lot more hidden things going on. And let's face it, he's not president, so he's not as visible. He doesn't have the voice he once had. He doesn't have the platforms he once had access to. So it's just not as visible. So you might not see things going on very obviously with Trump like you will for Biden, but there is a lot going on for him, a lot. So that's how you would read it in terms of, and by the way, one of the things about his moon anyway is that it's the 12th Lord. So it's bringing out the 12th house indications. And obviously we're seeing a lot with Trump in all of his financial matters being, challenged, and things, being exposed or threatened to be exposed, and all of these things, but also hidden enemies being exposed, and all of these things it's just a very murky kind of quality of Ketu in Scorpio anyway. So again, remember that the thing with the nodes and the eclipses themselves is that they can just as easily obscure things as they do reveal things. So we will see both. We'll see both for both of these people, and we'll see both in our own lives, where things can get very distorted. Things can feel ramped up in the next few weeks. Things have an urgency about them, as if we have to make a decision. And like yesterday, like I really need to do something about this. There's that kind of churning that occurs, like it's told in the mythological story of the churning of the oceans. It's ramped up, and we feel the intensity of it and the urgency to make a decision, where it really, is it, I would question, necessary? Is it really necessary to make a decision about anything? Or is it maybe wiser to actually slow down, cool down, maybe just take your time with this, allow the churning to settle down, and then when things settle, then you're more clear about things. One last thing I would say about this, look at Jupiter when there's an eclipse occurring, to see where it is in your chart, to see that kind of guiding principle and light and understanding and clarity around what is a very confusing time generally. And it's going into Aquarius as these eclipses unfold. So as the first eclipse occurs in Taurus, it's crossing over, and then it's crossed over by the time, a couple of weeks later, by the time the solar eclipse in Scorpio. So in Aquarius, what is it for you? For Trump, it's the 7th sign. So there's some guidance there for him for sure. For Biden, it's the 4th sign, also a really important place to put Jupiter. So it's this kind of home, relationships for Trump, more home environment, and his followers, because it's his 5th house Lord. His followers and his family, his guiding principles and his values, and how those bring him happiness and stability when all of these changes are about. So for Biden, this will be a very personal sort of needing to kind of orientate himself to what he really values and what is important to him. Whereas with Trump, you can see that it is his 5th house Lord as well. So his followers are also very important to him as well, but it's also the 8th house Lord in the 7th. So there's going to be, for Trump, these kinds of more kind of hidden dynamics going on you could say, than for Biden. And again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, because we can see that in the politics, in how these things are playing out, these kind of more hidden aspects for Trump, and hidden relationships and followers and all of these things. We can see, it's quite obvious why we could see this kind of this hope that he has in a way as well. And when we see articles like that in The Guardian, saying things like, is Trump planning for a 2024 coup? That's encouraging for him as well. That's giving him hope, because he has an aspiration as much as anyone else, right? So anyway, that is the eclipses. I'll talk more about the eclipses anyway, I'm sure. I'll do my usual audio recording for the new moon or the full moon coming up next weekend, and then a couple of weeks later for the new moon and the total solar eclipse. And I'm sure I'll be talking about it again in other formats. If you have any comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you have any questions, please feel free. I always love to hear questions. It brings the conversation further. And until next time.